I want you all to join me for a moment, for a journey, if you will. Close your eyes, sit back, and calm yourself. Imagine you are for a moment a Soviet. Not just any Soviet, you're an aircraft designer, and it's 1931. And rumbling in the distance is the latest twin-prop design from your aircraft manufacturing plant. You crane your eyes up to the sky and open them to be greeted with this vision. A plane that is a two-seater pod connected to a tail structure by a pair of water pipes. Yes, water pipes. Each side of the cockpit. Between those pipes, behind the pilot is a propeller, and in front of him is a second propeller. The aircraft trundles along with a maximum speed of 300 kilometers an hour, with nearly 16 meters of wingspan. But what makes this aircraft special? You know, other than the way it looks, which is certainly a design choice. Well, those water pipes holding it together, they have both been repurposed. They are, in fact, giant recoilless rifles. Welcome one and all to the fun zone that is the Soviet attempt to mount a recoilless rifle into an aircraft. Welcome back to 5 Minute History, the weekly series where patrons choose the topic. This week, we're going to be discussing this monster. Courtesy of, well, the patron asked me not to share their name, but I appreciate them nonetheless. Soviet aviation during the Second World War is either often totally overlooked by Western sources or told through iconic aircraft such as the IL-2 Sturmovik, the Yak-9, or the PE-2. These machines really symbolized the USSR during the Second World War, its ability to mass produce, its defective designs, and even if they weren't the best to meet the oncoming threat and support the Red Army, well, they still worked. They still did the job, and they still were produced in the numbers that were needed, albeit they were supported by extremely large amounts of Lend-Lease aircraft, including the Cobra. Less well known though, but no less fascinating, is the Soviet experimentation with recoilless rifles and recoilless aviation guns mounted on aircraft, and generally speaking, this occurred in the pre-war years. These weapons represented an attempt to solve a big problem in aerial armament. How do you deliver very large caliber firepower from a relatively light aircraft frame without, blowing up your plane with recoil? The thing a bomb can do, but we're going to ignore that. Just wait a moment though before you all go sniggering and rush to mock the USSR. There will only be a mild amount of that going ahead. I want you all to remember that recoilless weapons were not unique to the Soviet Union. However, the fun part is that the Soviets were among the earliest and most experimental with the concept as a whole, particularly when it comes to aviation. During these interwar years throughout World War II, Soviet designers explored recoilless cannons in a number of roles, including as bomber defense weapons, ground attack armament, and even as potential tank killers fired from the air. Although these weapons never became mainstream, they do show up in this pre-purge stage of the USSR scientists where they were willing to actually try to do different things. But first, for those who don't know what a recoilless rifle is, or at least don't know outside of the Helldivers 2 stratagem, traditional artillery and artillery cannons rely on recoil management. Systems such as heavy gun mounts, recoil springs, and hydraulic buffers or reinforced airframes. As the caliber increases, so does the recoil, and if you've ever fired a rifle, you can really tell the difference. The 22 is very different to something that fires 7.62. And so, with all this logic, bigger means harder to mount large guns on lightweight platforms, like aircraft. In aviation, excessive recoil will quite literally tear a plane apart with the sheer power of that recoil alone. Hell, old Age of Sail ships even had this problem as well, that if the cannons were too big for their mountings, they could become incredibly dangerous weapons. Put that on a plane and yeah, it's no bueno. But the recoilless rifle, it was conceived to be a solution to this problem. By venting propellant gases to the rear, a recoilless weapon balances the forward momentum of the projectile with the rearward momentum of the expelled gas. And the idea is, it gives you minimal or little recoil. In theory, this allows very large caliber weapons to be mounted on really light structures, like jeeps, planes, ships, and well, Vespers. The Soviet Union had a long-standing interest in these unconventional weapons, and they eyed them off with glee during the 20s and the 30s when they were desperately trying to leapfrog ahead after the disastrous Civil War. Soviet engineers, influenced by both domestic innovation and foreign ideas, explored this dynamic, and also rocket artillery and dynamo reactive guns and other non-traditional weapons for this purpose. The Soviet term for recoilless guns was Dynamo Record. You know what? I'm not going to say it. I'm just going to put it on screen. Essentially, it's a fancy way to say a weapon that was balanced boomstick. Among the most influential people in this field was Leonid Kachevsky, an engineer whose work dominated the Soviet recoilless weapon development during the 30s. Now, Kachevsky believed that recoilless guns could revolutionize both ground and air warfare, enabling an unprecedented amount of firepower on these very, very light and early platforms. And honestly, if it worked, it could be huge. Think light tanks like the BT with guns comparable to, well, small destroyers. Kachevsky's designs were even more bold though, and they range from small caliber artillery weapons held by infantrymen to massive anti-aircraft mounted cannons. The early 30s really was the perfect time for him to try this too, because the Soviet military was eager to modernize, and well, just right now, Stalin wasn't going to, shoot him in the back of the head. Yet. Stalin gets around to that very, very shortly, but he's got a brief window of hope to try different things. Now, at first, these guns were installed for testing on bomber aircraft as defensive or offensive weapons, but they were a bit smaller and usually mounted in nose positions or under the wings. Several types of these aircraft dynamo reactive guns were developed with the backing of the military, and they were commonly designated with abbreviations such as APK or DRP. Now, the calibers range from approximately 76 mils to over 100 mil, and this far exceeded what conventional aircraft cannons of the era could achieve, and theoretically being the kind of weapon that could supplant bombs due to cost effectiveness. These weapons fired shells comparable in size to field artillery rounds, and in theory, a single hit would destroy an enemy bomber or inflict a massive amount of damage on ground targets such as a bunker, a trench, an armoured vehicle, hell, even a ship or a base. Not to mention the possibility of using them against critical infrastructure such as bridges and tunnels. After initial tests proved somewhat promising, the Soviets developed several platforms for the mounting of these weapons. These included the TB-1 from Tupolev and the TB-3 heavy bombers, Polikarpov fighters that were designated as experimental platforms, and of course the absolute gem that triggered this video and that I've been a bit coy with its title, and the one that I opened the video with, the I-12, built as a test aircraft for these weapon trials. And yes, it really did have repurposed water pipes as its main weapons and tail structure. It also had the fun little issue that if the pilot tried to bail out, he became a thin veneer because he had to jump between either the forward or rear propellers. Recoilless aircraft guns did suffer from some pretty heavy drawbacks though. These included, but were not limited to, backblast because it's a giant gun, low ammunition because it's a giant gun, low accuracy because it's a giant gun, and lastly, reliability issues, because it's a gigantic gun being put on a plane pre-World War II through a water pipe. In aircraft installations, these problems were shockingly magnified. Backblast could actually scorch the fuselage or wings, and the muzzle velocity made air-to-air kind of, pointless. You were never going to actually hit the thing in a fast air fight. During the late 1930s, after the Second World War started, and particularly in the 40s when, the USSR got involved, there were ground attack aircraft fitted with these recoilless weapons, and some prototypes mounted large recoilless guns beneath the fuselage or in fixed forward firing positions. But it never really worked, and autocannons quickly replaced them just because, they were more reliable, they were just better. Back in the pre-war years in the mid-1930s, confidence in Kachevsky's designs was pretty well gone though, and many of his weapons actually just completely failed to meet performance expectations. And some were dangerously unreliable. This all meant that during the Great Purge, and you will be absolutely not shocked to hear this, Kachevsky was arrested and executed. Standard Stalin behaviour. By the time the war started, there were no more recoilless armed aircraft in mainline service in the Soviet arsenal, and it was a bit of a waste of time. But the research did help with further Soviet aircraft development, so it wasn't all to waste, and like I said, they did find some usage. Thank you all for coming. Like, comment, subscribe, shout out to the patrons, and I'll catch you all next time.